Claire Corleone stood in the shadowed archway of the East Wing, her pulse thrumming against her throat as she watched her husband's hand, steady, gentle, impossible, rest on the young maid's shoulder. And the way Allison Barzini flinched wasn't fear, but something far more dangerous. Something that looked like grief, dressed as restraint. Hello, beautiful souls, and welcome back to a story that's going to unravel every assumption you've ever made about loyalty, love, and the secrets that live in the silence between a man and the one person he refuses to break. I'm so glad you're here with me today, and I have to ask, where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop your city or country in the comments, because I love seeing how far these stories travel. And speaking of traveling with me, how are you doing today? Really, I want to know. Are you cozy? Are you sneaking this during a break? Are you binge watching in the middle of the night? And here's the real question that matters. Have you subscribed to the channel yet? If you haven't, do me a favor right now and hit that subscribe button, because you're about to step into a mystery so thick with tension and heartbreak that you won't want to miss a single story I bring to you. Trust me on this now. Let me tell you what this story is really about. It's about a woman who has everything a mafia boss's wife should have: power, luxury, protection, and a husband whose name alone makes grown men tremble. But none of that matters when she starts noticing the one thing that doesn't add up. The one crack in the empire built on blood and loyalty. And that crack has a name: Allison Barzini. A maid who glides through the mansion like a ghost with unfinished business. A girl no older than 23, with dark hair that falls like silk against her pale neck, and eyes that hold an entire ocean of unshed tears. And the most terrifying part isn't that she exists. It's that John Corleone, the man who once shot a traitor point blank at the dinner table without blinking, has never, not even once, raised his voice at her. Claire had been keeping count. 67 days since Allison started working in the mansion, and 67 days of watching her husband's entire demeanor shift like a man stepping into a confessional every time the girl entered a room. His jaw softening, his shoulders losing that coiled violence he wore like a second skin, his voice dropping into something that sounded almost like tenderness. And it was that tenderness that struck Claire like a blade between the ribs, because John Corleone didn't do tender, not with staff, not with soldiers, not even with her on most days. The other maids had noticed too. Claire caught their whispers in the kitchen, their eyes sharp with envy and confusion. Why only her? Why does he defend her when she breaks the crystal? Why does he let her leave early? Why does he watch her like that? And Claire had ignored it at first, told herself it was nothing, told herself her husband was many things but never a cheater, never reckless enough to jeopardize everything they'd built. But ignoring it became impossible the night she saw Allison standing in the hallway outside John's study at 2 a.m, her small frame trembling, and instead of fury, instead of accusation, John had emerged from his office and simply looked at her, just looked, and the weight of that gaze carried something so heavy, so suffocating, that Claire had to grip the banister to keep from collapsing under the sheer gravity of it. That was 3 weeks ago, and since then Claire had been watching, really watching, cataloging every micro-expression, every word unsaid. Every moment John's fingers twitched like he wanted to reach for the girl, but forced himself to stop. And Allison, for her part, seemed to live in a state of perpetual flight, her eyes always downcast, her movements precise and small, as if she were trying to take up as little space as possible, as if existing near John caused her physical pain. Claire knew the language of guilt when she saw it, had seen it on the faces of men before her husband put bullets in their skulls. But this wasn't the guilt of a man caught in an affair. This was something older, deeper, carved into his bones like a scar that never healed. And the way Allison avoided looking at him felt less like shame and more like survival. Like if she met his eyes, she might shatter into 1,000 irretrievable pieces. The mansion itself seemed to hold its breath around them, the marble floors echoing with footsteps that never quite met, the crystal chandeliers casting fractured light across scenes of near misses and almosts, almost speaking, almost touching, almost breaking whatever silent pact kept them orbiting each other in endless, agonizing distance. Claire's hands were shaking now as she stood in that archway, watching her husband's thumb brush once, barely, against Allison's shoulder before he pulled away like he'd touched fire, and the girl's eyes finally lifted, just for a heartbeat. And what Claire saw there wasn't desire or seduction or any of the things she'd braced herself for. It was recognition, the kind that comes from blood, from shared loss, from a connection that predates choice. And that's when the first cold finger of real fear traced down Claire's spine, because she realized with sudden, horrible clarity that whatever tied John Corleone to Allison Barzini, it wasn't something as simple or as forgivable as lust. The question that had haunted the mansion for 67 days now lived in Claire's throat, like a scream she couldn't release. Why only her? What made this one girl untouchable in a world where everyone else was expendable? And as John's eyes found Claire's across the dim hallway, as she saw the flash of something that looked devastatingly like regret cross his face, she knew she was about to uncover a truth that would either save them all or burn their entire world to ash. And there would be no going back from this moment. No one seeing what she'd already seen. No one knowing what her heart was already screaming at her to understand. That Allison Barzini wasn't just a maid, and John's protection of her wasn't kindness. It was penance for a sin Claire didn't yet have a name for. Claire had built her entire life on the foundation of certainty. Certainty that she understood the rules of the world she'd married into. Certainty that loyalty and silence were currencies more valuable than gold. Certainty that she knew every shadow and secret in John Corleone's dark empire. But now that foundation was crumbling beneath her feet, and she realized with brutal clarity that her deepest fear wasn't death or betrayal in the traditional sense. It was irrelevance. It was discovering that the man she'd stood beside for 8 years had a chamber in his heart. She'd never been allowed to enter, a history she'd never been told, and that terrified her more than any rival family's guns ever could. She'd met John when she was 24, a financial analyst who'd unknowingly audited one of his front companies, and instead of making her disappear like his advisors suggested, he'd been fascinated by her refusal to be intimidated, had courted her with a strange mixture of brutality and tenderness, and she'd chosen this life with open eyes. Trading the ordinary world for one where love wore the face of danger, and every day was a gamble, with stakes most people couldn't fathom. What Claire wanted more than anything, more than safety or wealth, was to matter. To be the woman John chose not out of obligation or appearance, but because she was essential to him, irreplaceable, the one person who truly understood the man beneath the monster. And for 8 years, she'd believed she was exactly that, until Allison Barzini walked through their doors and revealed a tenderness in John that Claire had never inspired, a brokenness she'd never been trusted to heal. The morning after she'd seen them in the hallway, Claire sat in the sunlit breakfast room across from her sister-in-law, Vincent Corleone's wife, Esther Valalong, a sharp-tongued woman with ice-blue eyes who'd survived 3 assassination attempts and still insisted on taking her espresso with exactly 2 sugar cubes. Never more, never less. And Esther was the closest thing Claire had to a real friend in this world of carefully constructed alliances and strategic marriages. "You look like you haven't slept," Esther said, her voice carrying that particular blend of concern and calculation that came from years of reading people's weaknesses. And Claire wanted to confide in her, wanted to spill every observation and fear. But the words stuck in her throat because speaking it aloud would make it real, would transform suspicion into accusation, and she wasn't ready for that war yet. Just restless. Claire lied, watching as Allison moved through the room with a silver coffee pot. Her movements so carefully neutral that the neutrality itself became suspicious, and Esther's gaze followed Claire's, landing on the young maid, with the kind of predatory assessment that made her so dangerous at the poker tables John's associates frequented. That one's odd, Esther murmured, quiet enough that only Claire could hear. She carries herself like someone trying to disappear, but there's breeding there. You can see it in the way she holds her spine, the way her hands move. That's not a girl raised in poverty, or if she was, she wasn't born to it. And the observation landed in Claire's chest like a stone, because she'd noticed it too. The way Allison's manners were too refined, her vocabulary too educated in the rare moments she spoke. The way she looked at the artwork in the halls with recognition rather than mere appreciation. Before Claire could respond, no, she caught herself. She meant Thomas Brewster, John's consigliere and oldest friend, a man whose loyalty had been tested in blood more times than anyone could count, entered the breakfast room with his characteristic silence, his gray eyes missing nothing as they swept across the scene. And he'd been with John since they were teenagers. Running numbers in Brooklyn, knew every secret, every body, every deal that had built this empire. Claire. Thomas acknowledged her with a slight nod, his voice like gravel wrapped in silk. John's asking for you in his office. And something in the way he said it felt like a warning, like he knew she'd been watching, knew she was circling closer to whatever truth they were all protecting. And she wondered not for the first time how many people in this mansion were complicit in the mystery of Allison Barzini. Claire's relationship with Thomas had always been cordial, but distant. He was John's confidant, not hers. And there were nights she'd seen them talking in hushed tones that went silent the moment she entered, conversations she wasn't privileged to access. And she'd accepted that because every king needed a counselor. But now she wondered what else Thomas knew, what else he'd helped John hide. As Claire stood, smoothing the silk of her dress, she caught Allison's reflection in the sterling silver coffee pot. And for just a moment, their eyes met in that distorted surface. And what Claire saw there wasn't defiance or guilt, but a profound sadness. The kind that comes from losing everything before you're old enough to know what everything means. And she found herself thinking that whatever Allison was hiding, she was suffering from it too, that this secret was a prison for both of them. If you're watching this and you're as desperate as I am to understand what's really happening in this mansion, drop a comment below with your theory. Do you think Allison is John's former lover? His illegitimate daughter? Something else entirely? I'm reading every single comment, and I love seeing your detective work. You might even figure it out before Claire does. Walking through the marble corridors toward John's office, Claire's mind catalogued every interaction she'd witnessed between her husband and the mysterious maid. The way he'd intervened when the head housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, had tried to fire Allison for breaking an antique vase. The way his voice had gone cold as winter when one of his soldiers had made an inappropriate comment about her appearance. The way he'd personally approved her schedule to ensure she never worked late nights when dangerous associates visited the house. And none of it spoke to desire. All of it spoke to protection, to responsibility, to a debt he believed he owed. Claire's hand trembled slightly as she reached for the heavy oak door of John's study, and she realized that whatever happened in the next few minutes would define everything that came after, would either restore her certainty or shatter it completely. And she wasn't sure which outcome she feared more, because at least uncertainty left room for hope, while truth, once spoken, was irrevocable and absolute. John stood behind his massive mahogany desk, backlit by the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the east gardens, where Allison was currently trimming roses with the kind of careful precision that seemed to define everything she did. And he didn't turn when Claire entered, which meant he knew exactly why she was there. Had probably been expecting this conversation since the moment their eyes met in the hallway last night. "Close the door," he said, his voice carrying that particular flatness he used when preparing for violence. And Claire's hands were steady as she pushed the heavy door shut, sealing them in together with whatever truth was about to detonate between them. "How long have you been watching?" John asked, finally turning to face her, and Claire was struck by how exhausted he looked. Not physically, but spiritually. Like a man carrying a weight that had been breaking his back for years. And she realized this moment had been inevitable from the day Allison arrived. That they'd all been hurtling toward this confrontation like a car with cut brakes. "Long enough to know that girl isn't just a maid," Claire said, keeping her voice level even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "Long enough to know you're protecting her from something. Long enough to see that whatever she is to you, it's eating you alive." And she watched her husband's jaw tighten, watched him weigh his options in that calculating way that had kept him alive in a business where most men died young. The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled taut, ready to snap, and Claire made her decision in that moment. She would have the truth, all of it, even if it destroyed her. Because living in this fog of half-knowledge and whispered questions was a slower death than any bullet, and she deserved better than to be a stranger in her own home. "Tell me who she is, John," Claire demanded, and her voice cracked on his name, despite her best efforts to stay strong. "Tell me why you look at her like you're staring at a ghost. Tell me why every single person in this house walks on eggshells around her except you. Tell me what I did to deserve being shut out of this secret." And she hated the desperation creeping into her tone. But she was beyond pride now, beyond strategy. She just needed to understand. John's eyes closed for a brief moment, and when they opened again, Claire saw something she'd never seen in 8 years of marriage. Fear, genuine and raw. Not fear of enemies or prosecution, but fear of losing her. Fear that the truth would be the one thing his power couldn't protect him from. "She's not my mistress," he said quietly, and Claire realized she'd been holding her breath waiting for him to say exactly that, to confirm or deny the affair she'd half convinced herself was happening. "I've never touched her that way, never even thought about it. Claire, you have to believe that." And the desperate sincerity in his voice was almost enough to make her believe him. Almost. But it didn't answer the real question. "Then what is she?" Claire pressed, stepping closer to his desk, close enough to see the muscle twitching in his jaw, close enough to smell the bourbon he'd already been drinking, even though it wasn't yet noon. "Because whatever she is, John, she's destroying us. Can't you see that? Every day she's here is another day you pull further away from me. Another day I become less of a wife and more of a prop in whatever performance we're staging for the families." Before John could answer, before he could finally give her the truth she was clawing for, the office door burst open and Thomas Brewster stood there, his face drained of color, his phone still clutched in his hand, and Claire had never seen the unflappable consigliere look rattled, but he looked absolutely shaken now. "We have a problem," Thomas said, his eyes darting between John and Claire. "Santino just called from the East Gate. There's a man here asking for Allison by her real name, her full name, the one we buried." And the temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees as John's entire body went rigid. his hand instinctively moving toward the drawer where Claire knew he kept his primary weapon. What name did he use? John's voice was deadly quiet, the voice he used right before he ordered executions, and Thomas swallowed hard, looking like he wanted to be anywhere but in this room, delivering this news. He called her Allison Barzini, Thomas said, and then added the words that made Claire's world tilt sideways. But he also called her by another name, Allison Demetrios, and he says he's her uncle, says he's been looking for his brother's daughter for 5 years, says he knows she's here and he's not leaving without her. The pieces started clicking together in Claire's mind, with horrifying speed. The familiar features she'd never been able to place. The way Allison's profile, in certain lighting, reminded her of someone. The old photograph she'd seen once in John's private safe, before he'd caught her looking and sealed it away without explanation. A photograph of a young woman with dark hair and eyes exactly like Allison's. And suddenly Claire understood why John had never raised his voice at the girl, why he protected her like his own blood, why guilt hung around him like a shroud whenever she was near. Demetrios, Claire whispered, the name pulling up memories of stories John had told her early in their marriage, stories about his youth, about a woman named Isabella Demetrios, who'd loved him before the life consumed him, before violence became his native language, a woman who disappeared one night and was found 3 weeks later in the river, killed by the Santorini family in retaliation for a territory dispute. And John had always said it was his fault, that loving him had signed her death warrant. And Claire had never thought to ask if there had been more to the story, if Isabella had left behind more than just memories and regrets. She's Isabella's daughter, Claire said. Not a question, but a statement, watching her husband's face confirm what her heart had already figured out. And you never told me, never trusted me with this, just brought her into our home and expected me to what, John? To not notice, to not care. And then the final, most terrifying piece fell into place, the one that made her breath catch in her throat. Is she yours? Is Allison your daughter? The question hung in the air like a guillotine blade, and before John could answer, before he could shatter or save their marriage with whatever words came next, an explosion rocked the east wing of the mansion, the windows behind John's desk blowing inward in a shower of glass, and somewhere in the chaos of alarms and screaming staff, Claire heard someone shouting that the rose garden was on fire, and all she could think was that Allison had been in the rose garden, and from the look of absolute terror on her husband's face, he was thinking exactly the same thing. John was moving before Claire's mind could fully process what had happened, his body a weapon unleashed as he vaulted over the desk and sprinted toward the east wing, with Thomas already barking orders into his phone, calling for the security team, the medical staff, the soldiers who lived in the outer buildings, and Claire found herself running too, her heels abandoned somewhere in the corridor as she raced barefoot across marble floors, slick with the champagne someone had dropped in their panic, because whatever complicated knot of jealousy and confusion she felt about Allison Barzini, she didn't want the girl dead, didn't want to see that kind of devastation on her husband's face. And she was surprised to realize that somewhere in the last 72 hours of obsessive watching, she'd started to feel something almost protective toward the mysterious maid. The rose garden was chaos incarnate, flames licking up the wooden trellis, smoke billowing black and thick, staff members running with fire extinguishers and blankets. And John was shouting Allison's name with a desperation that would have shattered Claire's heart if she'd had time to feel anything beyond the adrenaline screaming through her veins. There! Thomas pointed toward the far end of the garden, where a figure was stumbling away from the flames. And it was Allison, her face smudged with ash, her uniform torn at the shoulder. But she was alive, she was walking, and the relief that crashed through Claire was so intense. It almost brought her to her knees. John reached Allison in seconds, his hands gripping her shoulders, turning her this way and that, checking for injuries with the frantic precision of someone who'd lost too much already. And Claire watched the girl's face crumple, watched her fight against tears as she shook her head, trying to tell him she was fine, even as her whole body trembled. "I'm okay," Allison was saying, her voice hoarse from smoke. "I saw the device. I ran. I'm okay." And those words, "I saw the device," sent ice through Claire's stomach because it meant this wasn't an accident. This was an attack, a message. And someone knew exactly who Allison was and exactly how to hurt John Corleone. Claire approached them slowly, her tactical mind already working through the implications, even as her heart struggled with the intimacy of watching John hold Allison at arm's length, his eyes scanning every inch of her for damage. And when Allison's gaze finally found Claire's over John's shoulder, there was something in that look, something that seemed like apology and resignation, and a bone-deep exhaustion that made her seem far older than 23. "We need to get her inside," Claire heard herself saying, her voice steady and commanding in a way that surprised her. "And we need to find that man at the gate before he disappears. Because either he planted the bomb or someone followed him here. Either way, we're exposed." And she watched John's eyes snap to hers, watched him register that she was thinking strategically rather than emotionally. And something like gratitude flickered across his face before the mask of the Mafia boss slammed back into place. The next 3 hours were a masterclass in controlled chaos. John's soldiers swept the grounds and found the remains of a remotely detonated explosive device, small but deadly, placed precisely where Allison had been working, while the man claiming to be her uncle had vanished from the front gate before anyone could detain him. And Thomas had pulled security footage showing a dark sedan with obscured plates leaving the property minutes before the explosion. Claire found herself in the library with Esther, who'd appeared the moment the emergency calls went out, because that's what family did in their world. And Esther was watching Claire with those calculating ice blue eyes that saw far too much. "You're handling this well," Esther observed, pouring them both 3 fingers of whiskey, even though the sun hadn't set. "Most wives would be falling apart or demanding answers, but you're playing the long game, aren't you?" And Claire realized her sister-in-law was right. Something had shifted in her during that moment of crisis. She'd stopped seeing Allison as a threat to her marriage and started seeing her as a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit the picture she'd been painting. "I need you to tell me everything you know about Isabella Dimitrios," Claire said quietly, and Esther's eyebrows rose because that name was ancient history, buried deep in the years before Claire had entered this world. But Esther had been around then, had been married to Vincent when John was still young and reckless, and in love with a girl his family would never approve of. Esther took a long drink before answering, her voice careful and measured in a way that told Claire she was choosing each word deliberately. Isabella was beautiful, brilliant, completely wrong for this life. And John loved her the way young men love when they don't yet understand that love isn't enough to keep someone alive in our world, Esther said, and Claire felt each word like a small cut. She got pregnant, never told John because she knew what his family would do, knew they'd either force a marriage that would destroy both of them or make the problem disappear, and she ran. And here Esther paused, her eyes distant with memory. But the Santorinis found her first, killed her as a message to John's father, and by the time we discovered she'd been pregnant, the baby had vanished into the foster system. Lost, untraceable. Claire's mind was racing because if Allison was Isabella's daughter, the timeline worked, the features matched. But the question of paternity was still unanswered, still the live wire running through everything. Does John know if she's his? Claire asked, and Esther's expression turned genuinely sympathetic, which was somehow worse than her usual sharp detachment. I don't think John knows, Esther admitted. I think he found the girl, saw Isabella's face staring back at him, and made the choice to protect her regardless of blood. Because whether she's his daughter or just the daughter of the woman he failed to save, the debt is the same in his mind. And that answer was somehow more complicated than a simple yes or no, because it meant John's guilt and obligation ran deeper than biology, deeper than Claire knew how to compete with. Before Claire could process this revelation, Thomas appeared in the library doorway with Allison beside him, and the girl looked small and scared, but there was steel in her spine now, a determination that hadn't been there before the explosion. She wants to tell you everything, Thomas said, looking at Claire rather than Esther. She says you deserve to know the truth before anyone else dies for it. And Claire felt her breath catch, because this was the moment, the confession she'd been circling toward since that first night in the hallway. Allison stepped forward, her hands clasped in front of her to stop them shaking, and when she spoke her voice was quiet but clear. My mother's name was Isabella Dimitrios, and she told me before she died that my father was a dangerous man, a man who would either save me or destroy me, and she made me promise to never look for him, Allison said, and tears were streaming down her face now, but she didn't stop talking. But when John found me 6 months ago, when he showed me her picture and told me he'd loved her, I thought maybe I'd finally found someone who could tell me who I really am. And the heartbreak in those words was so raw that Claire felt her own eyes burning. But I don't know if he's my father. He won't take a paternity test, won't confirm or deny it. He just brought me here and watches me like I'm a ghost. He's trying to protect from his own past. The vulnerability in that confession, the shared pain of two women loving the same complicated man in completely different ways, broke something open in Claire's chest, and she found herself crossing the room and doing something she never imagined she would do. She pulled Allison into an embrace, felt the girl collapse against her, sobbing. And Claire understood with sudden clarity that this wasn't about competition or replacement. This was about a broken family trying to assemble itself from pieces scattered across decades of violence and loss. If you're still watching, drop a comment telling me whether you think John is actually Allison's father, or if there's something else going on here, because this mystery runs deeper than any of us expected. The three women were still standing in that fragile tableau of shared grief when John entered the library with a leather folder clutched in his hand, his face carved from stone, and Claire knew immediately that whatever he was about to say would change everything, would burn down whatever assumptions they'd managed to build in the last few minutes. "I need to tell you something," John said, his eyes moving between Claire and Allison. "Something I should have told you both months ago, but I was a coward. I thought if I could just keep everyone safe, keep all the pieces separate, I could protect you from the truth." And his voice cracked on that last word in a way that made Claire's chest constrict, because John Corleone didn't break, didn't show weakness, and seeing him unravel meant they were standing on the edge of something catastrophic. "I did a DNA test," John continued, opening the folder with shaking hands. "The day after I brought Allison here, I took a sample while she slept, sent it to a private lab in Switzerland, and I've had the results for 58 days. And Allison made a small wounded sound, her hand flying to her mouth, because he'd known all this time and never told her. Never gave her the answer to the question that had defined her entire existence. Claire's heart was hammering so hard she could hear it in her ears as she waited for confirmation, for John to finally admit that Allison was his daughter, that he'd kept the secret to protect them all from the complications of a child born outside their marriage. But when he spoke again, the words came from somewhere so much darker. "I'm not her father," John said, and the relief Claire expected to feel didn't come because his expression wasn't relieved. It was devastated. The test was conclusive. Allison and I share no biological connection. Isabella's daughter isn't mine. And Allison's knees buckled, Claire catching her before she hit the floor, holding this girl who just had her last hope of belonging ripped away. "Then why?" Allison sobbed, her fingers clutching at Claire's arms. "Why bring me here? Why protect me? Why look at me like that if I'm nothing to you?" And the anguish in her voice was so profound that Claire felt it in her own bones, felt the particular devastation of being unwanted by the one person you'd built all your hopes around. John crossed the room and knelt in front of both of them, his eyes red-rimmed, and Claire realized with shock that he was crying. Actually crying, tears cutting tracks down his face. "Because I know who your father is," John said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And when I found out, when I saw the name on that DNA report, I realized that you're in more danger than I ever imagined. That the only reason you're still alive is because no one else knows the truth." And he pulled another document from the folder, his hands trembling so badly he could barely hold it. Claire took the paper from him, her eyes scanning the technical language until she found the conclusion, found the paternal match that had been run against a database sample, and the name she read there made her blood turn to ice in her veins. Stefano Barone. Stefano Barone, the current head of the Barone crime family, John's most dangerous rival, the man responsible for 3 attempted assassinations against the Corleone family in the last 2 years alone. The man who'd ordered Isabella Dimitrios killed 24 years ago, not knowing she was carrying his child. "Oh my God," Claire breathed, and suddenly everything clicked into a new and horrifying configuration. Isabella must have been involved with Stefano before John, or during, or maybe she'd been caught between both families. And the Baronas had killed her not realizing they were murdering the mother of Stefano's own daughter, and if Stefano ever discovered that Allison existed, that his bloodline had survived. "He can't know," Allison was saying, her voice rising toward panic. "Please tell me he doesn't know. Please tell me that's not why someone just tried to kill me." But John's expression was answer enough, and Thomas appeared in the doorway again, his phone pressed to his ear, his face grim. "Stefano Barone just called," Thomas announced, and the room went deadly silent. "He says he received an anonymous package this morning containing a DNA report and a photograph of his daughter. And he wants her returned to him within 48 hours, or he's declaring war on the entire Corleone family." And Claire felt the world tilt, because this wasn't just about protecting one girl anymore. This was about preventing a bloodbath that would consume every family in the city. Allison was shaking her head, backing away from all of them, her eyes wild. "No, no, I won't go to him. I won't be used as leverage or peace offering or whatever he wants me for. I didn't ask for any of this. I just wanted to know who I was." And her voice was gaining strength, gaining fury. "My mother died running from these families, and I won't let her death mean nothing by walking straight into the same trap." Claire found herself moving to stand beside Allison, found herself making a decision that would have seemed impossible 72 hours ago. "She's not going anywhere," Claire said, her voice cold and commanding. And she watched John's eyes widen slightly because he knew that tone, knew she'd made up her mind and nothing would change it. Stefano Barone doesn't get to claim a daughter he never raised, never protected, never even knew existed until someone gift-wrapped her location for him, and we're not handing her over like property. John stood, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Claire saw something like hope cross his features. You understand what you're saying? He asked quietly. You understand that protecting her means war, means every soldier we have on the streets, means our lives, our family, everything we've built is at risk. And Claire stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and took her husband's face in her hands. I understand that this girl is standing in our home asking for protection, and I understand that you loved her mother enough to carry guilt for 24 years. And I understand that despite everything, despite the secrets and the lies, you're still the man who chose honor over convenience, Claire said, and she kissed him then, fierce and desperate, claiming him in front of everyone. And I'm choosing to stand with both of you. Because maybe that's what family actually means in this world. Not blood, but choice. Not obligation, but love. The kiss deepened, became something more than strategic alliance or public declaration. Became a reconnection of two people who'd been drifting apart, finding their way back through crisis. And when they finally broke apart, Claire saw something in John's eyes that had been missing for months. Complete, unguarded trust. There's something else, Esther's voice cut through the moment, and everyone turned to find her standing by the window, her phone in her hand, her expression more serious than Claire had ever seen it. I just got a message from a contact in the Barone family, and apparently the man who showed up at our gate this morning claiming to be Allison's uncle. He's not family at all. He's Stefano's second in command, which means Stefano was testing our defenses before the real assault. Thomas was already on his phone, already calling in reinforcements, and John's entire demeanor shifted from grieving protector to tactical commander in the space of a heartbeat. Fortify the mansion. No one in or out without my personal approval, and get me every piece of information we have on Stefano's current operations, John ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos. And then he turned to Allison. I need you to trust me now. Trust that I will die before I let him take you. Do you understand? Allison nodded, tears still streaming down her face, but there was something fierce in her expression now. Something that reminded Claire viscerally of what John had said about Isabella. Beautiful, brilliant, completely wrong for this life, but brave enough to run, to fight, to choose her own path even when it killed her. And as Claire looked around the library at this impossible family they were forging in fire, her husband with his ancient guilt, the girl who carried enemy blood, the sister-in-law who saw everything, the consigliere who knew all the secrets. She realized that the war coming for them wasn't just about territory or power. It was about whether love and choice could triumph over blood and destiny. And for the first time in 8 years of marriage, Claire felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be, fighting for something that actually mattered. Drop a comment right now and tell me if you would protect Allison or hand her over to prevent a war, because this choice is about to tear everything apart. The attack came at 3 a.m, not with explosions or gunfire, but with something far more insidious. A phone call from the district attorney's office informing John that federal agents would be executing search warrants on all Corleone properties at dawn, and Thomas's face went pale as he listened to his own contact confirm that someone had fed the FBI a detailed map of their operations, complete with evidence that would put John away for life. And Claire understood immediately that Stefano Barone wasn't coming for them with soldiers. He was destroying them with the law, making it impossible for John to protect anyone from inside a federal prison. We have maybe 4 hours to sanitize everything, Thomas said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. But Claire, they specifically mentioned you in the warrant. They have financial records linking you to money laundering operations. They're going to arrest you too. And Claire felt the floor drop out from under her because she'd always been so careful, had always kept her hands technically clean. But apparently careful wasn't enough when someone with Stefano's resources wanted her gone. John's hands were fisted at his sides, his jaw clenched so tight, Claire could see the muscle jumping. Take Claire and Allison. Get them out of the country. I have passports and accounts set up in the Caymans. You can be on a plane in 90 minutes, he said to Thomas, but Claire was already shaking her head because running meant abandoning everything, meant admitting defeat, meant letting Stefano Barone win without even fighting. I'm not leaving you, Claire said, her voice fierce, despite the terror clawing at her insides. We face this together, or not at all. But John grabbed her shoulders, his eyes wild with fear, and she realized this was his deepest nightmare manifesting. Not his own destruction, but watching the people he loved suffer because of choices he'd made decades ago. If you stay, you go to prison. Do you understand that? You'll spend the next 20 years in a federal facility while I rot in another one. And Allison will end up in Stefano's hands anyway because there will be no one left to protect her. John was shouting now, his composure completely shattered. So please, please, Claire, just this once don't fight me. Just go. Just survive. The desperation in his voice broke something in Claire's chest, but before she could respond, Esther burst into the room with her phone extended, her face drained of all color. It's Vincent, she said, her voice shaking in a way Claire had never heard. Stefano's men took him 2 hours ago. They're saying it's a trade, Vincent's life for Allison, and we have until sunrise to decide. And the room went completely silent because Vincent was John's younger brother, was Esther's husband, was the father of 2 children currently sleeping in the West Wing. And suddenly, this wasn't just theoretical danger anymore. This was family bleeding in real time. Allison made a sound like a wounded animal and ran from the room before anyone could stop her, and Claire found herself chasing the girl through marble corridors, finally catching her in the conservatory, where moonlight streamed through glass panels and illuminated Allison's face wet with tears. I have to go to him, Allison said, her whole body shaking. I can't let someone die for me. I can't be responsible for tearing your family apart. Maybe Stefano will be a good father. Maybe this is what's supposed to happen. But even as she said it, Claire could see the terror in her eyes. Could see she was trying to convince herself of a lie, because the truth was too horrible to face. That Stefano Barone would either use her as a political pawn or kill her the moment she became inconvenient. That she would never be a daughter to him, only a weapon. You're not going anywhere, Claire said, gripping Allison's arms. We'll find another way. We'll get Vincent back. But her voice trailed off because she didn't know how. Couldn't see a path through this nightmare where everyone survived. And for the first time since this began, Claire felt true despair settling into her bones. The next hour dissolved into chaos as John's soldiers fortified positions, and Thomas worked his contacts trying to locate where Vincent was being held, while Esther sat statue still in the library, her ice blue eyes fixed on nothing. And Claire had never seen her sister-in-law look so breakable, so utterly human in her fear. John found Claire standing in their bedroom, staring at the closet where her go-bag was already packed, because in their world, you always prepared for the day everything burned down. And when he wrapped his arms around her from behind, she felt him trembling, felt the weight of impossible choices crushing them both. I can't lose you, he whispered against her hair. I've made so many mistakes, failed so many people, but losing you would end me completely. So please, Claire, please take Allison and go. Let me handle this. Let me fix what I broke. And Claire turned in his arms, saw the man she'd married stripped of all his armor, vulnerable and terrified, and still trying to protect everyone even as the world collapsed around them. You want to know what my deepest fear is? Claire asked, her hands framing his face. It's not prison. It's not death. It's living without you. It's being safe somewhere while you fight alone. It's surviving when you don't. And she kissed him with everything she had, pouring 8 years of love and partnership and choice into that kiss. So no, I'm not leaving. We stay together. We fight together. We win or lose together. Their kiss deepened, became desperate and consuming, hands clutching at each other like they could merge into one person who couldn't be separated or destroyed. And Claire felt John's tears mixing with her own as they clung to each other in the pre-dawn darkness. And she thought maybe this was what marriage really meant. Not the easy days, but this, choosing each other even when choosing meant walking into fire. Thomas's voice cut through their moment, sharp and urgent from the doorway. John, we have a problem. Allison's gone. She left a note saying she's turning herself over to Stefano, and the tracking device we put in her phone shows she's already halfway to the Barone estate. And Claire felt her heart stop because they'd failed, despite everything they'd promised. Despite all their determination, the girl had slipped through their fingers and was walking straight into the lion's den. John was moving instantly, grabbing weapons, shouting orders. His face transformed into something terrifying and focused. But Claire grabbed his arm, forced him to look at her. If you go after her now, you'll start the war. Stefano will kill Vincent. The FBI will arrest anyone left standing, and we'll lose everything, Claire said, hating every word coming out of her mouth. We need a different play, something he won't expect, something that turns his own strategy against him. But before either of them could formulate a plan, before they could find a miracle in the ashes of their options, Thomas's phone rang, and he answered it on speaker. And Stefano Barone's smooth, cultured voice filled the room like poison. John Corleone, I believe I have something of yours. Both something, actually. Your brother and my daughter. And in 6 hours, the FBI will have you. So I'm curious how you plan to negotiate from a position of having absolutely nothing left to bargain with. Stefano's laugh was cold and triumphant. You should have stayed away from Isabella. Should have let her come back to me when she realized her mistake. But you've always been possessive of things that don't belong to you. The line went dead, and Claire watched her husband's face cycle through rage and despair, and finally land on something that looked like resignation, like a man who'd finally run out of moves. And she realized with horror that John was giving up, that he couldn't see a way forward. And if he surrendered now, they were all lost. Tell me in the comments what you would do in this situation, because right now, it looks like there's no way out. And I need to know if you can see something Claire can't see. Claire stood in the silence that followed Stefano's call, her mind racing through every conversation, every detail, every piece of information they'd gathered. And suddenly, something Esther had said hours ago clicked into place. The comment about the man at the gate being Stefano's second-in-command, about him testing their defenses. And Claire realized with sudden brilliant clarity that Stefano had made a mistake, had revealed something he didn't intend to reveal. Because if he'd sent his second-in-command personally, then he was operating with a very small circle of trust, which meant most of his own family didn't know about Allison yet, didn't know he had a daughter, and that was leverage. That was the crack in his armor they needed. The DNA report, Claire said suddenly, her voice cutting through John's despair. Stefano said he received it anonymously this morning, which means someone inside his own organization is playing games, someone who wants him destabilized. And if we can figure out who sent it, we can figure out who to make a deal with. Thomas's eyes lit up with understanding, his tactical mind immediately seeing where Claire was going. Paolo Barone, Thomas said. Stefano's nephew. He's been positioning himself to take over for years. And if he's the one who exposed Allison's existence, he did it to make Stefano look weak, to show the family that their boss kept secrets. And that means Paolo doesn't actually want Allison alive. He wants her to be the catalyst for Stefano's downfall. John was shaking his head, trying to follow the logic through the fog of his panic. But that doesn't help us. If Paolo wants chaos, then we're still. But Claire grabbed his face, forced him to focus on her, to see the plan forming in her eyes. It helps us because Paolo doesn't know that we know he sent the report, which means we can offer him exactly what he wants, Stefano's destruction, while getting back everything we need, Claire said, her voice gaining strength with each word. We give Paolo evidence of Stefano's other secrets, the ones Thomas has been collecting for years. The financial crimes, the deals with foreign governments, everything that would turn his own family against him. And in exchange, Paolo releases Vincent and ensures Allison disappears from Barone family records permanently, like she never existed. Esther was on her feet now, her strategic mind engaging. The Ice Queen persona snapping back into place as she saw the possibility of saving her husband. Paolo would take that deal. He's been looking for ammunition against Stefano for months. And if we hand him enough to stage a coup within the family, he won't care about one girl he never knew existed, Esther said, pulling out her phone. I can reach him. He owes me a favor from the Santorini negotiations last year. But John was looking at Claire with something like awe in his eyes, and he pulled her against him, kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her mouth, like he was trying to memorize her through touch. You're brilliant, he whispered. You're absolutely brilliant. And I'm sorry. God, Claire. I'm so sorry I didn't trust you with the truth from the beginning. I thought I was protecting you, but I was just protecting myself from having to face what I'd done. From having to admit that I failed Isabella, and I was failing you too, by keeping you in the dark. Claire felt tears burning in her eyes, but she blinked them back because there would be time for this later. Time to rebuild what the secrets had damaged. Right now, they had to move. We can talk about forgiveness when everyone's safe, Claire said, but she softened it with a smile. With a kiss that promised they would have that conversation, would have a future to have it in. Right now, we need to move fast. We have maybe 5 hours before the FBI arrives, and we need to execute this perfectly, or we lose everything. The next hour was a symphony of coordinated chaos. Esther contacted Paolo Barone and arranged a meeting at a neutral location, an old warehouse that had served as negotiation ground for decades. While Thomas compiled every piece of damaging evidence they had on Stefano, documents that proved he'd been skimming from family operations, working with federal informants, making deals that benefited himself at the expense of Barone's soldiers, and it was enough to paint him as a traitor, enough to justify a change in leadership. John was coordinating with his most trusted soldiers, preparing for the possibility that this was a trap, that Paolo might try to eliminate them all and take both families' territories. But Claire could see the hope returning to his eyes, could see him transforming from a man resigned to loss, back into the strategic commander who'd built an empire. I need to come with you, Claire said, as John was checking weapons, and she watched him start to protest, start to insist she stay safe, but she cut him off. Allison is there, and when we get her back, she's going to be traumatized and terrified, and she needs to see a friendly face, someone who chose to protect her, not someone who looks at her and sees ghosts and guilt. She needs me, John, and I need to be there. John studied her face for a long moment, and Claire saw him wrestling with his protective instincts and his respect for her autonomy. And finally he nodded. You stay behind me. You wear a vest, and if anything goes wrong, you run. Those are my conditions, he said. And Claire agreed, because she wasn't trying to be reckless. She just needed to see this through, needed to be part of the solution instead of waiting helplessly for news. They arrived at the warehouse at 4:30 in the morning, the sky just beginning to lighten with the threat of dawn. And Paolo Barone was already there with 3 of his most loyal soldiers, and he was younger than Claire expected, maybe 35, with sharp features and calculating eyes that reminded her viscerally of Stefano based on the photos she'd seen. "You have the evidence?" Paolo asked without preamble, and Thomas handed over an encrypted drive. "This implicates me in nothing, and gives you everything you need to remove Stefano and take control of the family with the backing of your captains." Paolo examined the drive, then nodded to one of his soldiers who brought forward Vincent, bruised and bleeding but alive, and Esther ran to her husband, her composed facade cracking as she checked him for serious injuries. "And the girl?" John asked, his voice deadly calm, and Paolo smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. "My uncle has her at his private estate. He's been interrogating her, trying to understand why she was hidden from him, and I'm afraid he's not inclined to let her go. Paternal instincts and all that," Paolo said, and Claire felt ice forming in her stomach because this was the betrayal. This was where the plan fell apart. But then Paolo's smile shifted, became something more genuine. "However, I don't have paternal instincts. I have practical ones, and practically speaking, a traumatized girl with no training and no loyalty is a liability, not an asset," he said, pulling out his phone and making a call, speaking rapid Italian, and then he hung up and looked at John. "My people are extracting her now. They'll deliver her to your secondary property within the hour, and in exchange, I expect the Corleone family to stay neutral when I make my move against Stefano. No interference, no judgment, just professional distance." John extended his hand, and Paolo shook it, and Claire watched a deal made in blood and pragmatism seal itself. Watched the future shift and reform around this moment. "The FBI warrants?" Claire asked, because they still had that problem, still had federal agents preparing to raid their properties. And Paolo's smile turned almost friendly. "The evidence against you came from Stefano's contact in the district attorney's office, a man who will be far too busy dealing with corruption charges of his own to pursue cases built on illegally obtained information," Paolo said. "Consider it a bonus for your cooperation, Mrs. Corleone. And a demonstration of how much more effective my leadership will be than my uncle's." They left the warehouse as the sun crested the horizon, and Claire sat in the back of the armored car with John's arm around her and Esther holding Vincent's hand, and no one spoke because they were all too exhausted, too emotionally wrung out to process what they'd just survived. When they arrived at the secondary property, a fortified townhouse in the financial district, Allison was already there, wrapped in a blanket, her face pale and bruised. And when she saw Claire, she burst into tears, and Claire held her. This girl, who'd become something like a daughter in the span of 72 impossible hours. And she understood finally what John had been trying to protect, understood the fierce love that came from choosing family rather than inheriting it. John knelt in front of both of them, his eyes on Allison. "You're safe now, and you'll stay safe. I promise you that. But I also promise that you get to choose what happens next. Whether you stay with us or start over somewhere new. Whether you want to know more about Isabella or leave the past buried. It's your choice, not mine, not Stefano's, yours." Allison looked between John and Claire, and despite everything she'd been through, despite the terror and pain, she smiled. "I choose family," she whispered. "I choose staying." The peace lasted exactly 16 hours before Stefano Barone bypassed his nephew's coup attempt and showed up at the Corleone mansion gates with a private army of 40 soldiers, and Claire watched from the security monitors as he stood there in his tailored suit, looking directly at the cameras with eyes that promised death. And she realized that Paolo had underestimated his uncle's network, underestimated how deeply Stefano's paranoia ran, how many contingency plans a man like that kept hidden even from his own second-in-command. "He knows," Thomas said grimly, watching Stefano's convoy block every exit from the property. Paolo must have moved too soon, must have tipped his hand before he had the votes locked down. And now Stefano's here for scorched earth. He's not leaving without Allison, or he's not leaving any of us alive. John was already arming every soldier they had, already positioning people as strategic points. But Claire could see the math wasn't in their favor, could see they were outnumbered and outgunned, and the FBI raid had been delayed but not cancelled, which meant they had maybe 2 hours before federal agents arrived to find a war zone, and that would destroy them just as effectively as Stefano's bullets. Allison appeared in the security room, her face set with determination that reminded Claire painfully of the photographs she'd seen of Isabella. That same fierce courage that had made her run from dangerous men while pregnant and alone. "I have something," Allison said quietly, pulling a small leather journal from inside her jacket. "My mother gave this to me before she died, told me to keep it hidden until I was old enough to understand what it meant. And I've been reading it since Stefano's men took me yesterday." And she placed the journal on the table with shaking hands. "It's a record of everything. Every deal Stefano made with federal informants. Every murder he ordered. Every piece of dirty money he laundered. And more than that, it's proof that he's the one who ordered my mother's death. Not as retaliation against your family, John, but because she threatened to expose him when she found out she was pregnant, and he wanted her to abort me." The room went completely silent as everyone processed what this meant, and Claire picked up the journal with reverent hands. Because Isabella Dimitrios had spent her last years building a weapon, building insurance, building a legacy of justice for the daughter she knew she might not live to raise. She was an investigative journalist, Allison continued, her voice stronger now. Before she got involved with Stefano, before everything went wrong, and she never stopped documenting, never stopped gathering evidence. And she told me in her last letter that if the Barones ever found me, I should use this to buy my freedom or burn their entire empire down, whichever felt more just. John was reading the journal now, his eyes scanning pages of meticulous notes, dates, names, bank account numbers, photographs tucked between entries, and Claire watched his expression transform from grief to something like vindication, because Isabella hadn't been just a victim, hadn't been just a tragedy he carried. She'd been a warrior who'd fought back the only way she could. "This is enough to put Stefano away for life," Thomas said, his voice filled with awe. "This is enough to dismantle the Barone family completely. Every captain, every operation, it's all here." And then his eyes landed on a specific entry, and he went pale. "And it's enough to implicate 3 federal judges, 2 senators, and the district attorney who issued our warrants. This doesn't just destroy Stefano. This destroys everyone who protected him." Claire felt hope blooming in her chest, wild and dangerous, because this was the miracle they needed. This was the weapon that could end everything, but they had to move fast, had to act before Stefano breached their defenses. "We need to make copies and get them to every news outlet in the city simultaneously. Make it so public that Stefano can't contain it, can't buy his way out, can't make it disappear," Claire said, her mind racing through logistics. "And we need to do it in the next 30 minutes before he storms the house." Esther was already on her phone, already contacting the investigative journalist she'd cultivated relationships with over years of strategic information leaks, while Thomas coordinated digital uploads to secure servers, And John made a call that Claire didn't quite catch, but based on his tone was calling in every favor he'd ever earned. Claire pulled Allison aside, gripped her shoulders gently. "Your mother was extraordinary," Claire said. "She fought for you every day of your life, even after she was gone. And what you're doing right now, choosing to use this instead of running away, that's brave in ways most people never have to be." Allison's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. "I want him to know," she said fiercely. "I want Stefano to know that my mother beat him, that I beat him, that we're not victims he can just erase. I want him to feel what she felt when she realized he was going to kill her." 22 minutes later, as Stefano's soldiers were cutting through the outer gates, every major news network in the eastern United States received comprehensive digital packages containing Isabella's evidence, complete with authentication from 3 independent forensic analysts Thomas had on retainer, and Claire watched the feeds on multiple monitors as breaking news alerts started flashing, as anchors began reading from Isabella's journal with barely concealed shock, as Stefano Barone's face appeared on screen after screen with the word "fugitive" underneath. Through the security cameras, Claire saw the moment Stefano received the news, saw him check his phone, and then look up at the mansion with an expression of such pure rage that she instinctively stepped back, even though he was hundreds of yards away. But then something shifted in his face, shifted from rage to resignation, because he knew it was over, knew that even if he killed them all right now, it wouldn't matter. The evidence was out, the world knew, and there was nowhere left to run. The FBI arrived not to execute warrants on the Corleones, but to arrest Stefano Barone and 17 of his associates on federal racketeering charges. And Claire watched through the windows as the man who'd tried to destroy them was led away in handcuffs, as his empire collapsed in real time on every news channel. And she felt John's arms wrap around her from behind, felt his lips press against her hair. "It's over," he whispered, and his voice was thick with emotion. "It's actually over. We're safe. She's safe. Everyone's safe." Claire turned in his arms and kissed him, poured every ounce of relief and triumph and love into that kiss. And when they finally broke apart, she saw Allison watching them with a small smile and Esther holding Vincent close, and Thomas allowing himself the tiniest expression of satisfaction. And she thought this exact moment, was what victory felt like. Not the absence of enemies, but the presence of family, chosen and fought for and earned through fire. The news anchors were calling it the biggest organized crime bust in decades, were praising the anonymous source who'd provided the evidence. And Claire knew they'd never reveal it was Isabella Dimitrios. Would let the journalist rest in peace, knowing her final story had changed everything, had saved her daughter and destroyed the man who tried to erase them both. "What do we do now?" Allison asked, and she sounded young and uncertain, but also hopeful, like someone standing at the beginning of a life instead of the end. John smiled, genuine and warm. "Now we live," he said simply. "We stop running, stop hiding, stop carrying the weight of the past, and we just live, as a family, whatever that looks like." And as the sun set over the mansion, as federal agents cleared the last of Stefano's soldiers from their property, as news helicopters circled overhead documenting the fall of a criminal empire, Claire stood surrounded by the people she'd fought for, and thought that maybe love wasn't about perfection or ease. Maybe it was about this. Standing together in the aftermath, choosing each other again and again, building something beautiful from the wreckage of everything that tried to destroy them. And if you've stayed with this story all the way to this moment, drop a comment telling me what you thought of that twist, because Isabella Dimitrios was playing the long game all along, protecting her daughter from beyond the grave. And that's the kind of love that changes everything. 3 months after Stefano Barone's arrest, Claire stood in the mansion's garden watching Allison plant roses, the same variety that had been growing in the spot where the bomb had detonated. But this time there was no fear, no hidden danger. Just a young woman choosing to reclaim beauty from a place that had tried to take everything from her. And Claire marveled at how much had changed in such a short time. How the girl who'd moved through their home like a ghost now laughed freely, argued passionately about politics at dinner, and had started taking online courses in investigative journalism because she said her mother's legacy deserved to be continued, deserved to mean something beyond one spectacular takedown. John emerged from the house with 2 cups of coffee, handing one to Claire, and the casual domesticity of the gesture still made her heart flutter, because this version of her husband, softer, more open, willing to be vulnerable, was someone she'd caught glimpses of over 8 years, but never fully known until crisis had burned away all his defenses and left only truth. "She's talking about getting her own place," John said, watching Allison with paternal concern that he no longer tried to hide. "Says she needs independence, needs to figure out who she is outside of being Isabella's daughter or the girl we protected. And I know she's right, but it terrifies me, letting her go out there where I can't control every variable." Claire leaned into his shoulder, breathed in his familiar scent. "That's called being a parent," she said gently. "Loving someone enough to let them make their own choices, even when those choices scare you. And you're doing it beautifully, even though neither of us expected to become parents this way." And she felt John's arm tighten around her waist, felt him processing the word parent as it applied to his relationship with Allison, the daughter of his heart, if not his blood. The legal aftermath had been complex, but ultimately favorable. The evidence from Isabella's journal had created such a comprehensive scandal that prosecutors were desperate for cooperation, and John had negotiated immunity for his entire organization in exchange for testimony about Stefano's operations. And while it meant the Corleone family had to restructure completely, had to divest from anything remotely illegal, John had surprised everyone by embracing the transition, had started converting their holdings into legitimate businesses with an enthusiasm Claire found both amusing and deeply attractive. "I've been thinking," John said, and Claire recognized his tentative tone, the one he used when he was about to suggest something he wasn't sure she'd agree with. "About what you said that night, about wanting to matter, about being essential. And I realized I never actually told you that you've been the essential one all along. That every good decision I've made in the last 8 years came from trying to be worthy of you, trying to be the man you saw when you chose this life." Claire felt tears threatening because they'd had pieces of this conversation over the last 3 months, but never quite this directly, never with this level of raw honesty. "You matter to me too," she said, turning to face him fully. "More than I knew how to say when I was trying to be strong enough for this world. And I think maybe we both spent so long protecting ourselves that we forgot we were supposed to be protecting each other. But we're better now. We're real now. And I love you more for your scars than I ever did for your armor." John kissed her then, slow and deep and full of promise. And when they broke apart, he was smiling, that rare, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. "Marry me again," he said. "I know we're already married, but marry me again, the right way this time. With Allison standing up with us, with family that actually knows who we are, with vows that reflect the people we've become instead of the people we were pretending to be." Claire laughed, joy bubbling up from somewhere deep in her chest, because it was absurd and perfect, and exactly the kind of new beginning they needed. "Yes," she said. "Yes, absolutely, yes. I'll marry you as many times as you want. I'll choose you every single day for the rest of our lives." Esther and Vincent had moved to the countryside estate, prioritizing safety and peace after Vincent's ordeal. But they visited often, and Claire had never seen her sister-in-law so relaxed, so willing to let her guard down, and she understood that trauma had changed all of them, had rearranged their priorities in ways that made room for actual happiness instead of just survival. Thomas had been named CEO of the restructured Corleone Corporation, was using his strategic brilliance to build something legitimate and profitable, though he still maintained enough connections to ensure the family stayed protected, stayed informed, stayed one step ahead of potential threats because you could leave the life. But the life never entirely left you. Allison walked over to join them, dirt on her hands, sunshine in her hair, looking more at peace than Claire had ever seen her. "I've been thinking about my mother a lot," Allison said, settling onto the bench beside them. "About how brave she must have been to document everything while knowing it might get her killed, and I think I understand now why she did it. She was making sure that even if she lost, even if Stefano won, the truth would survive. I would survive, and love would mean something beyond just the tragedy." John's voice was rough when he spoke. "Your mother was the best person I ever knew before I knew Claire, and I failed her in almost every way that mattered. But I promise you, Allison, I won't fail you. Whatever you need from me, father figure, friend, protector, or just someone who remembers Isabella and can tell you stories about who she was before everything went wrong, I'm here, always." Allison reached over and squeezed his hand. And Claire watched this family they'd forged from impossible circumstances. This constellation of broken people who'd found wholeness in each other. And she thought about how the story could have ended so differently. How many moments could have gone wrong, how close they'd come to losing everything. But instead they'd fought and survived and come out the other side transformed. "Thank you," Allison said, looking between John and Claire. "For choosing me when you didn't have to. For protecting me when it would have been easier to hand me over. For showing me that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about who shows up when the world is burning and decides to fight the fire with you." Claire pulled Allison into an embrace, felt John's arms wrap around both of them. And she understood that this was the ending they'd earned. Not perfect, not without scars, but filled with love and choice, and the kind of hope that comes from surviving the unsurvivable together. 6 months later, Claire and John renewed their vows in the garden where Allison's roses had bloomed into something magnificent. And as Claire spoke promises, she actually meant to a man she actually knew. She thought about everyone watching the story unfold, everyone who'd stayed through the darkness waiting for the light. And she wanted them to know that love like this, complicated and hard-won and absolutely real, was worth every moment of uncertainty, every sleepless night, every terrifying choice, because in the end, the people you fight for become the people you can't imagine living without. And that's not just survival, that's triumph. That's joy. That's everything that matters. And to all of you, beautiful souls who've journeyed with us through every twist and revelation, every moment of despair and hope, I want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you for investing your time in this story. Thank you for your comments and theories and emotional investment. Thank you for being part of this community, where we explore what it means to love fiercely and choose bravely, even when everything is working against us. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something real, please share it with someone who needs to hear that broken things can be beautiful, that families can be chosen, that love can triumph even against impossible odds. Subscribe if you haven't already, because there are so many more stories to tell, so many more journeys to take together. And I can't wait to see where we go next. Drop one final comment, telling me your favorite moment from this entire story. And until next time, remember that you are loved, you are worthy, and your story, whatever it is, deserves a beautiful ending too.